Hi, my name is Mark Biernot, and I'm a research economist. And in this video, we're going to talk about China. There's a lot of buzz on the internet and on YouTube that China is collapsing. I see it in the Financial Times. Wall Street Journal is talking about the Chinese deflation. Financial Times is talking about Evergrande. You've got respectable YouTubers like Joe Blogs, who I really like actually, and Peter Zion talking about the collapse of China. Everybody's talking about this sleeping giant going back to sleep, or at least collapsing. So what is the data and what can we look at in terms of a conceptual framework? Is China going to fall? Or what is the China of tomorrow? Let's take a look at this. First, put it in perspective. China, it's probably the second or third in terms of wealth in the world. If you just aggregate the wealth, the US is probably about 33%. Europe is or the EU is 23%. And China's, it's about 18.8%. So it's a pretty wealthy country. But in terms of total GDP, it's 18.5 trillion, but per capita GDP, it's way down there. The United States is wealthier. Europe is wealthier. Denmark's wealthier, Norway's wealthier, Ireland's wealthier, Liechtenstein's wealthier, Singapore's wealthier. A lot of other countries, per capita GDP, that means basically PPP or however you want to translate it, is the average person pretty well off? And the answer to that, based on aggregate statistical data, or just ask me, I'd rather live in the United States. But China as a country is still on the rise. Its GDP, I think it grows about 4% a year now, and the exports are still growing, not as much as they were. What is the conceptual framework we can put this into? Well, here I like to look at two things, the real world and the monetary world. The real world is 1776, Adam Smith, wooden ships and iron men, people in apprentice shops banging out and creating real value. This is devoid of monetary influence. Then with the rise of central banks, we developed in economics monetary theory, and we're trying to understand how monetary economics creates and disrupts the real sector. And even if it does, you've got Austrian-esque economists talking about that. So the real world of China is this: 1.4 billion people, and up to 60% are going to higher education, and I'm talking about technical school, mathematics, college. That's a pretty high number. In the U.S., I think it's 43% or something. So that's the first thing. Second thing is they work very hard. Average work week in China is 49.8 hours a week. In America, it's more like, I think it's 38.3 hours. So if you've got 1.4 billion people educating themselves, particularly in science and math, and they're working very hard, that country is not going away. You may say, yes, but what about the demographic shifts? Yes, the demographic shifts are declining, but let's talk about demographics. The Great Plague, 1300s, demographic shifts, a decrease by 1/3, unfortunately. And yet, we had the Renaissance afterwards. Each person living and existing had more wealth around them and more capital and land. Also, Thomas Malthus, 1700s, made dire predictions about demographics and food. And population would outstrip food production. Since the 1700s, we've only gotten wealthier. Alvin Hansen, secular stagnation theory, 1938 onward, that, it's it for our advanced economy, secular stagnation. And then Larry Summers, Harvard University, 2015, reboots that theory. But the reality is, with each passing decade, each passing year, my life is getting better. So demographic shifts, economies, particularly capital, are fluid enough to be able to compensate. And that's another conversation. So the Chinese demographic shift and impact, yes, it may reduce internal consumption, but it may not be as impactful as you might think, because they can shift it into other things, and with technology offsetting it, as I've mentioned. Now, we can't predict fully the future because there's too many exogenous shocks and geopolitical events occurring. all the time. Think about 5 years ago and the world today, how much it's changed. You could never predict that. We can't even predict with the most advanced models the weather 3 days in advance. But the bottom line is the Chinese economy is still growing, and the people are educating themselves and working hard and are ambitious. You know, to contradict that statement, you'd have to show me some evidence. So the monetary problem in China is it's a crisis, yes. Okay, demographic, one thing, but monetary is real. Evergrande, property, real estate. This is going to put shockwaves all the way through the lower and middle class. The Chinese yuan, I don't know if I'd invest in it. I don't know if I'd touch it. Is it artificial? Is it real? Is it traded under market conditions? Chinese a mixed capitalistic system combined with state capitalism. But I just don't know. It's going to create monetary shocks. Will those shocks disrupt the real sector? Chances are they'll slow it down, have a lag. We may have a recession in China, but it's not going to permanently affect it. China's still on the rise. If you are, flying beneath the radar and you want to set up a business or a medium-sized company, you can do it jumping through some hoops. Just like my family in Europe grew up under communism, you could get wealthy if you just flew underneath, below the radar. Government doesn't care for, too much about you. Now, the big companies in China are obviously state-owned. But the real growth comes from the entrepreneurs at the lower level, small business. So China, still on the rise. Monetary disruptions, yes, check mark. And it's still going to increase in wealth. 10, 25 years from now, they're all going to be wealthier. Now, would I invest in China? Let me just tell you a story. Way back, way back, I used to work third shift at Howard Johnson's, 11 to 7. I think I was 16. I don't know, child labor laws and everything back then, but 7 days a week. Took a day off every other week. I accumulated in a massive money by the time I was in my early 20s. And I thought everybody said, Asia, So I invested in some, I think it was like, no cost mutual fund, Vanguard or something, and just let it stay there. Never really did anything. So I'm not going to personally invest in China because I don't know. I don't understand all the nuances. That money could have been invested in the U.S. stock market or the European stock market. Probably would have done a lot better. Some free capitalistic democratic system. Freedom index, you want to take a look at that in the correlation to economic growth sometime. So China's not disappearing, but it may have, modest growth in the future. And if it ever wakes up and jettisons this type of totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian government and embraces capitalism and some real ideas of free movement of labor and capital, foreigners coming in and embracing this transparency, it would just take off like there's no tomorrow. But I'm not going to hold my breath for that. So the bottom line is China not collapsing, not disappearing, not a demise forever. It may have a recession, but it's still there, it's still viable. Exports are increasing, growth is increasing, and we will see the geopolitical landscape play out. More important is the geopolitical exogenous events to see what happens going forward. Anyway, my name's Mark Biernot. I'm a research economist. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much. Have a great day.